So we can only really talk about the UK, can't we? Which started in 2020, wasn't it? 2019, 2020 with the National Sibling Sexual Abuse Project.
That was a Home Office one, right?
Yeah, and that seems to have kind of lit the touch paper for stuff for us anyway, at least. And when we took the project on, we didn't think it was going to be as big as it was in terms of all the work that's come out of it. So that's where we're at the moment, I think, with everything. There's a lot in the media as well, isn't there, of late, which wasn't around before. So the conversation's changing, I think, slowly.
I think it's about, to me, it's an evolution, not a revolution, in the sense that it was always there. And when you go back and like we've written a couple of blogs and we've talked to people over the past, say, 6 to 8 months, and especially American colleagues and colleagues in Australia who've said, as practitioners, this has been on our books for decades. This has always been there, but the research and the evidence base hasn't been there in the same way. And it's really evolving and coming into the fore. So you sort of hear people say, oh, look at this new phenomenon, that's sibling sexual behavior. And when you actually talk to people in the field, they're like, no, we've been dealing with this in therapy, in family therapy, in group for years. But it's sort of emerging. But Sophie's right, the conversation is changing at a social level. But I think it's always been there. It's just coming more to the fore.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think in terms of the practice, I think it has always been there. But I think what it's always been is it's always generated something, almost a professional anxiety. So I think particularly when we discuss child sexual abuse, that's almost more digestible to professionals in terms of we see a direct issue, which I think what's often the case is historically with sibling sexual abuse cases is that actually, you know, the approach often generates a kind of looking for a specialist service who can specifically work with this model itself. And I think that's one of the issues really, as well as how do we get people, I suppose, the stigma, and how do we address the stigma to get people, and even in the professional networks, to understand that there's a lot of good working models that currently exist that we just need to pull together and put a little bit of context around it, really, in terms of how we actually intervene and provide that support.
One of the conversations that I had on the Awareness Day, and this conversation is reminding me of it, was with Winifred Lewis, who's an expert in activism, effective activism. We were talking about what's necessary. Is it bottom-up grassroots stuff, or is it top-down professional academic information flowing into society to reduce the stigma? And she made an interesting comment. She said, well, if it's only top-down, then you're going to have the same problems you had with prohibition, when the government just imposes things on society and society rejects. And if you only have grassroots, it's going to fail. So you have to have the marriage of lived experience and grassroots and concerned citizens and all of that, meeting academia and professional practice somewhere in the middle to get society to pay attention. That, of course, is part of the Awareness Day, why we're doing the Awareness Day. But I think that's an important thing to remember.
It's to me, it's about the behaviour. For years, we've made an industry out of sexual offending being pathologized, that these are psychologically unbalanced people who are radically different from the rest of us, because that serves a purpose for society that allows us to remove ourselves from them and say, we're not like them, they're different, they're abnormal, and we're normal. But when we think about siblings, we have to think about the behaviour, the interaction, the context, everything surrounding it. So it has to be top down and bottom up. It can't be simply looking at the individual in front of you and saying, we're pathologizing your behavior because you're so radically different from every other family out there, because we know that's not the case. So we have to break those barriers down, and that's top down and bottom up.
But I think as well, the more that we start looking at it, especially in the current context, you know, we see how complex it is. I certainly didn't realise 4 years ago how complicated everything was, you know, on face value. And I suppose this is how it looks to wider society. It's quite straightforward. Part of CSA, and it's sibling sexual abuse. So I think one of the ways to move forward is to actually find a way to translate that complexity to wider society. So we kind of got people in the thinking space now talking about it, you know, like I said, it's been in the media, there's the Awareness Day. But I think now we've got to try to get people to reframe how they think about it in terms of this is a complex problem that has complex solutions. You know, there's not a quick fix, but notoriously, especially in kind of developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours, especially professionals like teachers, they're really hesitant to do anything or make decisions, but they like simplistic tools, But simplistic assessment tools or screening tools or referral pathways won't fit with a complex problem. But I think it's now's the time to start talking about the complexities that surround it as well.
Is there any opportunity, though, to simplify complexity? Because society doesn't do complex well. Complicated creates fear and lack of understanding, and I think feeds stigma. The more complicated it becomes, and also sort of following on from what you were saying, Kieran, it almost gives society a bit of an excuse to ignore it if it's too complex. Do you think there's a way to simplify, just generally speaking, so that society can hear the conversation without outright rejecting it?
I think as society, as communities, we learn through storytelling. That's what we do. If you look back at our narrative history, it's about stories, it's about things being relatable. When we teach in a way that people can understand what's going on. So to me, it's about saying, okay, you think this is the most abhorrent thing humanly possible, and I'm not saying that it's not. But so that shuts your conversation down and you say, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to acknowledge it. I don't want to deal with it. But how do we make that relatable to our everyday experiences? And you might say, well, it's not the same as smoking. It's not the same as drink driving, but there's similar processes going on. I think we have to make it relatable that people have to see themselves in cases where sibling sexual abuse happens. And we're not saying it's going to happen to you, but it's a relatable experience. And I think we don't do a good job of that. We other people and we distance people because that serves a purpose for us, because we don't want to look at the reality. So I do think it's actually thinking about, well, yes, sibling sexual abuse happens within families. What do we know about families? How does your family function? Do you always get on with your siblings? Is there dysfunctionality in your family? How do you respond to things? And seeing that as one of the outcomes of family systems, as well as other outcomes of family systems. I think we have to get better at telling narratives around this so people can hear and see and feel what that looks like in the real world.
But I also think that we do need to be transparent and say, this is complex. I think once you even say that sentence, it's like you acknowledge it's complex, and each different scenario will need a different fix or different conversations. But as long as it's brought into the conversation and it's been verbalised, I think that's a really important step to say this is complex and professionals aren't going to get it right first time.
I think there is something in that as well, though, about, the complexity, because I think the other side of that is that if we classify everything around sibling sexual abuse and we think about it all as complex, again, when that looks at an intervention, some interventions are going to be relatively straightforward as well. So I think we have to acknowledge that even in kind of social work practice teams or child protection agencies, there will actually be things such as family, domestic violence, substance use, neglect, child poverty, these themes that actually highlight really a range of complexities that professionals feel equipped and able to respond to. But I think that's the bit that really is important about awareness raising and promoting the understanding of this, that there's a lot of things that professionals currently manage that arguably would potentially cause further complexities in comparison. So I think there is something about those interventions, and I think that takes me to that point of what does an intervention actually look like and what would that be? And I personally don't think there is an answer to that. So I don't think there is a manual that can tell you how to respond and support a family impacted by sibling sexual abuse, because I think, those cases are going to be very, very different. That might be a family member that's a really young child, significantly young children in the family, and actually that focus is going to be not blaming parents, but working with parents to help them understand as well and process the trauma that's happened in this family. But then we might have an older child, for example, in late teens, who is abused a significantly younger sibling. Well, that's a very different thing again. So that intervention is going to have a completely different route and a different destination. So I do think there is a danger sometimes when we try to generalise and we try and produce tools that are there that covers a really broad area that actually it doesn't tick all those boxes. And I think we have to start to get comfortable thinking outside the box and use some of our existing resources that we have from other areas of practice to support families, opposed to over-focusing on one behaviour that's happened in the family.
And it's interesting, and that's why we have to think about the process and not the outcome, because at the minute we spend a lot of time, especially with my background in criminal justice, we spend a lot of time thinking about the product. So you've committed an offence. What's the index offence? You'll get sentenced as a consequence of that. You will get put on a treatment program, or you will get X, Y, and Z. We have to look at the process of what led to that behavior and that outcome. And a lot of the time we don't. We just focus on the offence and say, you have offended in this way and this is what we need to do, by sort of actually thinking about, why did you offend in that way? What led you to do it? The context of it, the family situation. That's really important. But that also means that we need to change our minds sometimes, especially in criminal justice, about the way that we think about offending behavior.
About the behavior, you mean the way we think about the offending behavior? Or so what I'm hearing you say is that we need to listen to the offender voice more to understand. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. I think so. For years, working in the field of treatment of people who have committed sexual offences, you hear things like they're pathological, they lie all the time, they're manipulative, and you hear this from therapists, and you go, "Why are you a therapist? If you genuinely believe that, why are you giving therapy to these people?" Because actually, none of that's part of the therapeutic relationship, and actually, that sort of would make me question your ability to give good treatment and therapy to that. And I'm not saying you have to be sympathetic. I'm saying you might have to be compassionate, or you might have to think in a slightly different way. But the only way that we can truly understand any behavior, whether it's sibling sexual abuse or not, is to talk to people who have committed those behaviors to understand why they've done it. And that's the only way you can build good prevention models and good treatment models.
And I think we've got to be really aware of language, haven't we? We know it's a big debate that even that's evolved over the last 4 years, and we shouldn't be calling people offenders, the under 18s and perpetrators. But again, that changes the conversation internationally, doesn't it? Because there's a lot of work going on internationally, but people refer to different things differently, which further complicates things. But I think, again, that's another conversation that will evolve and has to evolve. I think even my mind will probably change over the next few years as to how we refer to things as more research comes out. And I think it's having that awareness of the impact of language and what that has on professionals and how they work with families.
I think as well with the language, what I find difficult sometimes to navigate is when we have an adult present with us who's caused harm in a sibling sexual abuse context as a child, and then they go for support in adult life. What would worry me is that in some areas is that actually for me that person might have committed that behaviour or displayed that behaviour under the age of criminal responsibility as a very young child. They've now identified in adulthood that was abusive behaviour. But what's important to me is they shouldn't be treated as an adult sex offender in adulthood. So this individual may not have caused further harm throughout their later life, throughout teenage years or early adulthood. And what would worry me is the stigma, again, is that actually, are we really going to classify someone who displayed harmful sexual behaviour towards a sibling at maybe 6 or 7 years old, a sex offender, because they're now an adult referencing that behaviour? So I think that's the bit we have to be really mindful of, is that actually we're still, when we're getting adults presenting to us in that way, we have to be able to keep the child in the room. And actually, often what I've found in practice is a lot of unprocessed work that actually has never been addressed in childhood. And at times you're almost dealing with that child responds to what's happened. So I think the language is really critical on that front, you know.
It's like about 6 or 7 years ago, there was an article written by Gwenda Willis out of New Zealand, and it was a really powerful question that it asked, which was, why do we call people by the things we don't want them to be? And that's a really powerful question. So if we say to you, we don't want you to sexually offend, but we're going to call you a sex offender, you're like, well, actually, I'm already being labelled as that. I'm already being seen as that. So even if I stop offending, I'm still going to be called that. I'm still going to be referred to as that. So actually, what's the motivation to engage in rehabilitation and treatment? And I agree with David that, you know, a lot of these cases might be historic cases. A lot of these cases might be happened in childhood, but the prosecution doesn't happen until adulthood. and you're dealing with different things there. But for years I never worked in this project got me working in the field of children who sexually harm. That was never my area for years. I always worked with adults, and just the language and the concepts are so different in this. But what I always find fascinating, coming at this from the outside, is we work in cliff faces, don't we? In criminal justice is the cliff face. You've been caught. We want you to stop offending. You stop offending now. But you've got a cliff face at 16, a cliff face at 18, a cliff face at 21, and you're like, but development doesn't work like that. You suddenly, on your 17th birthday, don't become an adult magically, and your cognitive processing doesn't magically change. But our system says, oh, well, you're 16 years and 1 day, therefore we have to view you and treat you differently than we did yesterday.
I do think they're two very different conversations, though, aren't they? When we're talking about adults and we're talking about young people, and it is the grey area in the middle, isn't it? Where's the tipping point between childhood and adulthood, and personal responsibility? But then that kind of puts it back onto the complexity of it, and that it's really unique to each person. But I do think they're different conversations. So, like all my work's with young people, and so I feel really jarred when I hear people talking about adults who sexually harm, because it's not the language that I'm used to. I'm not saying I disagree with it, but it's just very different. It's a completely different way of speaking.
I think one of the interesting things that we're talking about here is that the complexity versus the sort of simplicity of when we look at, say, child sexual abuse, adult to child abuse. That's simple in that it's, you can draw a line and you can say, okay, this behavior is just wrong or whatever way you want to speak of it. And there's not these gray areas of anything. The language isn't confusing, and I don't think it ever was. It's not something that Kieran is more your background in criminal justice. So the whole language, the whole narrative, the nuances of age and maturity and brain development and all of these things, as you say, Sophie, makes it more complex. And if it's complex for the professionals and the academics, it's a nightmare for society. So how do we think of then sort of the next 5 years, which is what this conversation is about? What needs to happen, do you think, to bridge the gap between where we are now? Come a long way. And as you were saying, Sophie, just in recent years, you've got more lived experience folks showing up. There's more conversation with survivors of sibling sexual abuse. We're starting to hear a little bit from those who cause harm, and that's really helpful. But how do we simplify the conversation so society can hear it? I know you were saying, Kieran, before, it's about storytelling. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Storytelling is a fundamental aspect of being able to influence anybody on any subject. So that's a key piece of it. But what stories do we tell, maybe, is the conversation?
I think it has to be multidimensional approach, doesn't it? So from my perspective, it would be the relationship, sex and health education, but it's actually in the curriculum or it's in the planning for it. It's explicitly stated that teachers are going to talk about this, and that would be a really effective way of getting it into wider society's conversation very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Is to just put it out there in schools, but it's got to be in the policy, in the curriculum, in the guidance. It's got to say, we don't just talk to young people and children about keeping themselves safe. We specifically talk about sexual behaviours and harmful sexual behaviours between siblings.
Yeah. And I think even before we even get into the conversation about siblings, I think there's a thing around general sexual shaming within society. Until people can actually sit in a space and talk about healthy, productive sexual behaviour, how can we expect anybody to be comfortable talking about unhealthy or abusive sexual behaviour? I know that's a broken record for me that I always go on about, but I think it's so important, is how can we expect a teacher to navigate that complex conversation when they can't even have a conversation about masturbation? I think there's something in that for us to really think. And I feel for education staff, because I think there isn't enough. There's these wonderful resources produced, but where's the training? Where is that background information and that to navigate some of these conversations and support? And I think there's a much wider responsibility for society when you think of the sexual informants that are put out through the media, social media, pornography. that's all accelerated, but because we're so stuck in this place of not talking about sex and shutting down the conversation, the information's accelerating, but the narrative isn't. So we aren't keeping up with young people, and we aren't helping young people navigate some of these really hypersexual environments, and visuals. So I think even before we open the avenue to let people feel safe to talk about sibling sexual abuse or even sexual abuse, I think we need to find those safe spaces for them to talk about sex more generally, first of all.
I think it's even more fundamental than that. I think it's something about critical questioning. Through this project and lots of other projects, one of the things that we have seen is that we know that victims or survivors of sexual violence tend to report their victimization in adulthood. And there's many reasons for that, but one of the main ones is, as an adult, they can process and understand and contextualize their abusive experiences better and give vocalization to it in a way that they can't as children. And one of the things that the Siblings project is really brought out is this idea from victims and survivors who were sexually abused as siblings in childhood, this idea of, I didn't know it wasn't normal. Within my family, this was normalized. So there's this bigger question about how we critically interact and think about and challenge and question things. And one of the things that you said the other day, Nancy, which is sort of stuck in the back of my head, was when I forget her name, but when you interviewed the lady who used to be in the Waltons, and you said one of the driving forces behind that was everyone wanted their family to be the Waltons or saw their family as the Waltons. And the question is, where's the criticality in that? Even if you think back to your childhood and your best friends when you were growing up, and some of them may have had the most functional families, you go, God, I wish I was in that family, or that was quite cool. And now as adults, you talk to them and they say, well, actually, there was this, there was that, there was the other. And you're like, oh, I didn't notice that. But you don't start to see that to your teenager, do you? When you've got young kids, they're your life. You might have other kids coming over and staying at your house, but that's few and far between. But when you're a teenager and you're going around to other people's houses and you're seeing other family systems, you start to go, actually, my family don't get on like that, for better or worse. You say, my family are different from that. But the question is, where's the critical questioning of that? And I think sex education and relationship education is really important, it's essential. But we've also got to have that criticality to go, hold on, something here doesn't feel right. And I certainly feel in the UK, we have lost some of that critical edge along the way.
I think, though, alongside that, you need the safe spaces.
Yeah.
And I know I talk about it a lot, but a safe space is somewhere that a young person is free from shame or stigma, and they can go and talk about something that's happened to them or something they've done to get support. But we're nowhere near that at the moment. We're nowhere near that with developmentally normal sexual behaviours, that they can't go and unpick perhaps something they happen to have seen. I don't know, maybe somebody sent them some pornography, so they've inadvertently seen pornography. There's nowhere for them to go to talk to anyone, very rarely, and say, I've seen this, I really need to talk about it. So even with what's happening in wider society, we don't create those spaces for young people. So I think we're miles away. But I think, looking at how things have changed even over the last 4 years, with lockdowns as well, with COVID, even with all those hold-ups, it's moved forward massively.
Maybe one of the things to be considered for the bridge that takes us to where we want to go in this whole conversation is we're talking a lot about safe spaces for young people, areas that people can learn and explore, help to reduce stigma, all that sort of stuff. And what if it was the young person's peers that were providing the information and telling the stories in a supervised kind of way? What if the safe space could be provided by a peer? Because really, when you think about it, young people, people under the age of 18 or under the age of 16, when they've got a problem, the only person they can really go to get good information, quote unquote, is an adult of some way, shape, or form, whether that's a parent, a school counselor, something along those lines. To what extent do you think, because you guys are the experts in the area of professional practice and putting all these things and making them happen, is what if it was 15-year-olds that were being trained in how to create safe spaces, and they're deemed to be the support system. What is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in there. As you were talking then, I was thinking, well, young people automatically seek out peer support, and they're doing it through things like TikTok now and the accounts that they're following. And some of them are quite toxic, these accounts, but some are really good, and these TikTok accounts are run by young people. So they automatically, I think, will seek out others. But I do think that as long as it's kind of carefully constructed, but it can't be tokenistic, I think it could work because young people have got the agency to do that. But then it would have to be done in a way that made sure everybody's well-being was looked after.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it can't be tokenistic. It's got to be real. But yeah, there's definitely something in that. Definitely, because they do it automatically on TikTok.
They do it automatically, and they're not going to know which is good content and which isn't. That's one of the challenges with the social media and getting answers. And when we were talking in our Awareness Day piece, Sophie, you were talking about what encourages a lot of people to look for answers is the question, is it normal? Or no, that was Cami who originally said that. And then we talked about that for a while. And I remember being a young person wondering, are my thoughts normal? Is my behavior normal? And that piece of education isn't there either. So you don't even necessarily have to go into quote unquote sex education. It's telling stories to young people about what is normal in life generally. Is it normal for me to be worried about this, that, and the other thing? Is it normal for me to be happy and excited about this thing over here? I think kids are fundamentally always having the question, is it normal? And that piece is missing from education generally.
And I think the question is, as we move more and more into an online environment, and, I think we need to consider what regulation looks like. I don't think we need blanket bans on things, but we need to have a carefully constructed conversation about this. But the fact that you can go on YouTube, and let's just move away from sexual abuse for a minute, science videos. So say you're revising for your science exam and you go on, you have no idea what's on there. And one of my best friends is a science teacher, and he'll say, you go onto YouTube and you look at science teaching videos, and some of them are just preposterous. They make no sense whatsoever. But the question has to be, how do we help young people regulate themselves online and be able to identify good and bad and challenging and problematic practices?
It's not simple, though. It's not like that's a bad influencer. There are some really toxic influencers out there that will say things that I agree with. So, look after yourself, tidy your room, work hard. There are key principles that I would agree with. However, they can then say toxic things. So it's not like you've got kind of bad influence here and good influence there. It's really intertwined. But I think it's about equipping young people, I think, like you said, to critically think, but to have those conversations. And perhaps we just provide the infrastructure for them to have those conversations and the support that they need, but be led by them.
One of the interesting things that just popped into my head that could be throwing a little bomb into this conversation is, how about we talk artificial intelligence and the use that young people are, because now they're diving in and they're asking their questions to ChatGPT. And have you guys ever done a search in ChatGPT about anything to do with sibling sexual abuse? Have you ever thrown a question at artificial intelligence? Some of the answers are pretty interesting. So, and they're highly accurate as well, although not completely. So I wouldn't be surprised to see in the next 5 years more young people relying on the artificial intelligence companies of the world to get some of their answers instead of going to their peers or to complement going to their peers. So then how can we work to ensure that the information coming back is useful? Because, of course, artificial intelligence responses, my understanding of AI is limited, but the responses are generated from the totality of the internet. So all you need to have is information that's leaning in an unhelpful way to get some of that to come back in the answers. Though you can have gated artificial intelligence portals to answer questions so you can control the content. But I wouldn't be surprised in the next 5 years to find out that more and more people are actually asking, is X normal, to ChatGPT?
I think what I always go back to, though, when new things come up, is we love something to blame. Like, society loves to blame something. Like, we never take accountability. We never look at the traction. We never look at the foundational issues. And for me, when AI came up, One of the big things everyone was going on about was the use of AI in terms of generating abuse imagery and all these different themes. But for me, once again, though, we again look at the issue in terms of the byproduct of the problem, opposed to actually looking at the fundamental problem. And again, it goes back to that discussion around safe spaces and narrative and discussion, is that if we have things in place, then we're ready and we're equipped for what's next, and there's always going to be something. So AI will be boring in 2-3 years' time, and there'll be something else more advanced, and it's that consistent change. And so even virtual reality, for example, in terms of pornography, that starts to creep into a realm of actually we're starting to increase the ante of pornography in terms of there's a very visual and strong sensory overload of the content. So how does that change, the way that pornography is taken in and processed? But again, the issue isn't even that. It's about how do we ensure that prior to a young person watching pornography, however they choose to do that, they understand the core messages of consent, they understand the core messages of what that actually means, and also the reality that that isn't what real life's going to be like. That's not what real sex is going to feel and look like on your first time having sex. So I think there is something that we look at. But yeah, the AI thing is another thing that we can hang on to and blame. But I think it's important for us to address it prior to these other products, if that makes sense.
But how can we leverage it? I do believe that young people will look for more and more answers out of AI, for sure, because it is quote unquote safe. They don't have to ask anybody. There's no stigma associated with typing in a question to AI. There's nobody who's going to sort of, joke with them and say, oh, you don't know that, or, whatever. So it's safe in that they're sitting at home and they can ask AI. So how do we leverage positively AI in terms of, in the next 5 years, in terms of helping people to find the answers to their questions?
Is it different to Google, though? I think when although obviously the response and the themes, but I think when we look at over the young people accessing and seeking question online, it's just another source, isn't it? It's just another product to use and seek information. And I do think it goes, when we look at young people searching for things online, dependent on the source of the information will depend on the response in which they get. So if they get pulled into an area that's potentially a support service that's in a local authority or a third sector organisation, that might be a very different summary to if they get a support service that's in a religious institution, for example. So the value base might be very, very different. So that could make them feel very different about that response. So I actually wonder if AI has got elements of strength in terms of, I know an organisation back home who have started to use AI to kind of use on some of their training resources. So being used for something really healthy and productive and useful. So I sometimes think, is it that we actually have to embrace the new technology? And maybe it's for people like ourselves to kind of consider, how can we ensure that that's given the right response, opposed to us trying to consistently do what we've always done as adults and fight technology and fight social media? Do we have to embrace it slightly more?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there, isn't there? So the research is telling us at the moment that young people are not Googling things, they're looking on TikTok because it's an even quicker fix than reading something. So I think we've got to bear that in mind, the accounts that are on TikTok. But then in terms of AI and chat bots, so on Snapchat now, I don't know if you know, you can chat with someone, but it's an AI. So whether we start now to work with, and it's on everybody's Snapchat, it appeared on mine, whether we work with people like Snapchat, that actually there are key flags. If young people are asking questions about things that are happening with their siblings, are there key flags that Snapchat can have to make sure these young people are directed in a way that's useful for them?
And I think, what Sophie said there, it's the key thing, working with industry around this. The internet is bizarre and online communities are bizarre because anytime you talk about regulation or anytime you talk about safeguarding, it's an attack on freedom of speech. And you can't turn around and say that. And you're like, this isn't the Old West. This isn't 1718. We've got to think about the online environments that we're creating and what's out there, and it's safe and healthy to say, actually, is this something that we want in our online spaces? Where certainly in the UK, we're going through the online harms bill at the minute. And the reaction of a lot of the big international companies is, we'll just remove ourselves from the UK, or we'll base our headquarters somewhere else, rather than finding a way to have this conversation with industry and saying, right, how can we work together on this to make this a safer and more critical and more appropriate environment all round for everyone?
But I'd argue that I think as well that it becomes another weaponised political agenda. So I think in the UK around these subjects, I think the kind of right-wing agenda does influence some of the decision making, and I think this is the frustrating point again, is comes back to sex education and relationships, is when we start to politicise and weaponise these really important things that actually no politician has a right to interfere with. It's the well-being of a child, you know, and it's what's going to make them grow healthy and develop healthy. So I think there is something that we have to look at. And I mean, a lot of these tech companies, you can see that actually that political agenda is becoming skewed in terms of actually what we're trying to do for the greater good, if that makes sense, which I think Nancy and I covered a lot in the podcast last week on SiblingsToo. And I think one of the things around that is, how do we start to influence governments and local authorities to actually get them to support from that grassroots level, but also from higher up in strategic decision making?
I think it's notoriously difficult to do now because we can feel a backtrack. So one of the things that could inhibit any progress in this area is that really dangerous weaponisation of any discussions with young people around sexual behaviours, which again will push the stigma. All the work we've done to try to get rid of stigma around this issue and to minimise shame, they're going to come back. They're going to come back because it will be implied throughout the curriculum, you know, that we can't even talk to young people about developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours. So, you know, where does that leave sibling sexual behaviour and abuse? So I think we've got to be really careful, or well, not so much us, we've got to be aware of what's going on, because it could really, there could be a real conflict here between what young people are being told or not told and supported with in schools, and then what they're looking up online, and then what they're seeing in pornography, and then where they're going for advice. And there won't be any safe space. You know, you can only hope that they find a TikTok account that's valuable and research-based, and there are some out there, or they're asking the right questions to their Snapchat AI chatbot, and they're getting some good responses. But, you know, we don't want to hope that's happening. We want to, that there has to be this kind of multi-level scaffolding throughout. But I think that weaponisation is going to cause really big issues. Now, it's happening in the UK, and we see it in the United States. And there will be a shockwave from it if we're backtracking. And we know from all the research that young people are more likely to delay developmentally appropriate sexual behaviours with others if they have really good relationships and sex ed from a young age. So why wouldn't we be telling them when they could potentially be sexually harmed? But I think that's going to really trip everything up, is the weaponisation by the government. It's really dangerous.
And we are talking about sort of, in this context for the Awareness Day, this is an International Awareness Day. So contributions from Chile and Australasia and Europe and the Americas and stuff like that, where politics is just all over the place in all of those places. So sort of going back a little bit to some common denominators that we've been talking about. The common denominator in all of this is, first and foremost, siblings within a family context. That's whether we're talking sex education, we're talking politics in Argentina, you know, or anything like that. The common denominator is siblings within a family context. And I think that is where the root of understanding needs to be, and the root of discussion, and the root of conversations back and forth between siblings, the person harmed, the person who has harmed, the family, to deepen the understanding of what's going on in the family. And I think we all agree that research, as much as it has come along, is still woefully lacking in this area across the board. So really diving into and helping families and those impacted by sibling sexual abuse to step forward and tell stories in a safe space with no real fears of significant backlash, so that that understanding can be there. And then, if you remember, Sophie, in our conversation, there was a person on the call as well, Diane, who does a lot of body safety training, going back to what you were saying earlier, David, about teachers and stuff like that, there are specialists out there who can step into the school system. So it doesn't have to be the math teacher teaching sex ed. It can be experts who come in, and those may be organizations providing ongoing resources to the students as this outside vendor, as it were, providing into the school system. So if a student has a problem, they could potentially go to this organization that the school board has hired to support in that conversation, because not all teachers can manage this sort of conversation, right? So that's a potential over the next 5 years, is to start looking at that. One thing that we've talked about here in this conversation and also throughout the Awareness Day is a deeper understanding of the context within which sibling sexual abuse happens. That there's knowledge there now, but we could know more. What are the factors? What are the physiological factors, biological factors, the dysfunction in the family? So deepening that understanding over the next 5 years and coming up with new information, new programs, new ways of dealing with it. And then, of course, we haven't really talked much about there are tens of millions of adult survivors who have yet to step forward. They may have mentioned something to a spouse or to a close friend, but the majority of people that I know and that write stories in the SiblingsToo portal haven't told anybody except for maybe a very close person. And that is providing, I mean, yes, you can still have a nice, fulfilling life and everything, but I think we'd all agree that a life that has an element of important secrecy in it is still somewhat limited. If I can't share myself with you, then if I can't be authentic, then I can't connect with you. And if I can't connect with you, then we can't actually have a real relationship. If I can't fully connect with you, if I can't tell you my secrets, basically. And that's a whole other conversation, a whole other kettle of fish when it comes to sibling sexual abuse, because it's so historic.
I think one of the things that we haven't talked about that you sort of mentioned there, Nancy, was the family. In a lot of traditional either child abuse cases or rape or sexual assault cases, there's two players in it. There's the person who's harmed and the person who has been harmed. But in sibling cases, for better or worse, and some families act as a buffer to it, and some families enable the abuse to happen, you've got this third wheel there, which is the family. So it's not even like you've got victims saying, shame, I don't want to come forward, I don't want to discuss it. You've also got family members there, not necessarily understanding what's happened, maybe putting pressure one way or the other dynamics coming into the fore. So when we talk about sex and sex education and stuff like that, that's part of the key for the young people involved. But how do we reach the family members? Because there's a shame and a guilt that comes with this for parents as well, because there's a big part of this that's actually, this happened under my roof with my kids. Do I own this problem and hold my hands up and say, let's fix it? Or do we push the problem down and say, this didn't happen? Or how does this go? And I think that's what we don't understand. And that's different from other forms of child sexual abuse and other forms of abuse, because that third factor, that family factor, doesn't exist in the same way in other sexual abuse forms.
I think also, though, when we look at adult disclosures, in terms of adult survivors coming for support, I always get frustrated with how society expects survivors of victims of sibling sexual abuse to present, because I think sometimes, again, we make these professional assumptions that someone who's experienced that will need therapy, will need counselling. Actually, what we're finding a lot of thriving survivors within the kind of contact line is people just want to speak. They just want to have a voice. They don't actually always want counselling or therapy. Sometimes they just want to actually be able to say to someone, this happened to me. And I do get annoyed sometimes, because I think when we look at how we perceive people and how we have these expectations of what people should be, it comes up time and time again, even when how much can they cope with? Is that too much? Which I was at a training event not that long ago, and there was a group of survivors there who were representing independently, and I'd been invited along, and the organiser had said about it at the pre-conference meeting, should we take those slides out because that might be triggering? And around the table, there was nobody there with lived experience of that. And everyone almost nodded and said, oh yeah, and I put my hand up. I said, well, actually, with all due respect, that slide's nothing compared to what that person's been through. I think that's irrelevant. And actually, they've probably got a lot of resilience to cope with that in comparison to what they've actually been through in their life. And it was really interesting just to see the room change. And that's the bit, and Sophie used the word tokenistic before. I think there is something about when we're really, and I even hate the term using lived experience, it's about how we build lived experience into everything we do. So even from the strategic level of developing services, but also to the foundational kind of frontline practice delivery, I think it's got to be throughout, not just a 1 hour every quarter to tick a box and say, yeah, we ran that through lived experience, because I think that can be unhelpful. But yeah, I do think there's something different with this group as well in terms of what do they actually want? And I think that want is often a voice that's been suppressed within the family for so long. And just to be able to pick up the phone and say to someone, this happened to me, can be massive.
As a survivor myself, I can tell you that's absolutely true. Because usually you're so quiet for so long. You just need to say, this happened to me, not have the other person squirrel up their face or go, oh, that's nice, let's go for coffee, and change the subject and move on to something else, which is quite often what happens. I know for myself, when I told friends years ago, the conversation quickly changed. Actually, not even that long ago, I have some friends now, who are adults of the world and all that sort of stuff, and they just want to move that conversation well out of, we're not having that conversation. So knowing that I can speak my truth and not have people squirrel up their face at me or make really stupid comments like boys will be boys, I think is half the battle when it comes to that person's journey of recovery and healing. I totally agree with you that sometimes it's not any form of intervention, it's to be heard. Most people just want to be heard and validated, and that's what they want their life to be sort of about. But I know we need to start wrapping up our conversation. So for me, we've talked about a lot of different things and really important things that have started to happen, but maybe need to happen more of, and then some new ideas on ways to support families and children. I have often said that most of these sorts of things that grab society's attention, and you were saying this before, David, society likes to blame. So we need to there's usually a person or an institution that we can point at. So with abuse in the Catholic Church, we could point at the Vatican, or we could point at the Archdiocese of the city, or something like that. Sports teams, you can point at the coach. For sibling sexual abuse, there's no villain. It makes it very hard. And I think that's one of the reasons why society doesn't grab onto this conversation, is because they've got nobody to blame, really. But if we look at the villain in sibling sexual abuse being, for the most part, stigma, because if stigma didn't exist, or it was, say, reduced even by 10% or 20% societal stigma, we would be able to have more open conversations. We perhaps would get political will to get engaged and have more funding for research, have more funding for interventions. We would have maybe more concrete conversations about adding content into sex education. So for me, the villain in sibling sexual abuse is not sibling. It's the stigma, because we can't move forward if the stigma stays the way that it is. I feel it just becomes an uphill, pushing a square block up a hill, not even a ball. We're pushing a square block up the hill. So for me, that's the villain. So what I would like to see is society more engaged, and society taking a little bit of responsibility for not being open to have these conversations, and society to want to be more educated and engaged with the conversation. Because after all, society is supposed to be these nice, mature adults that can talk about subjects and find solutions to problems. That's what we like to think we are. So for me, over the next 5 years, I would like to see things, whether it's through storytelling, information sessions, the professionals and academics having more of a voice and coming up with the science rather than the sort of tokenistic bullshit that we often see in media and all that sort of stuff. That's what I'd like to see happen in the next 5 years. Kieran, how about you? What would you like to see happen?
I think it's an extension of that. We have to stop exceptionalizing this and normalize it. Sexual abuse affects between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people globally. You've got prevalence rates there that are in the same ballpark as things like cancer. So we have to normalize the way that we talk about sexual violence and child sexual abuse and sibling sexual behavior, and stop making it the exception. And that means that we have to look at ourselves and look at our family systems and think about actually what's going on, and have frank and open conversations about this. And when it does come up, confront it face on, and not say, actually, let's shut this door down and leave things to fester for 20 or 30 years. So to me, it's about normalizing it and not exceptionalizing it.
Mm-hmm. Sophie?
Yeah, I think for me, it's having it within the conversation on sex health and relationship education, but at a government level, have it taken seriously enough to be in the curriculum, but then enough resources for training, for educators, or people to come in to talk to young people about that. But then they can't just do that and then leave, or teach that session and then that's it, we move on to the next topic. There's then got to be the infrastructure for the safe spaces for the young people to come to unpick those issues. And I think a lot of that can be driven by young people. I think we can put something in place, but then it has to evolve with young people directing it.
I think for me, it's about actually, looking at the actual delivery of services in terms of under 18s and families. And I think one of the key things is for us to stop us and them and stop othering. I think it's really important that we see this as a collective family issue that we have to address and almost take on as a family. And that's not even specifically if we're working with this individual for reunification, or whether we're looking at this separation or it goes into a criminal justice context. It's still a family issue, no matter what the outcome of that is, desired or achieved. So I think for me, it's about how we start to build resilience within organisations to give supports to the entire family. And I think that really echoes a trauma-informed approach of that everyone in the family has a person within this hub, this organisation, and we can all work collectively to address the harm that's been caused. So I certainly think that's a big one for me.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to schedule to be back at the Cave Recording Studios in 2029 to redo this conversation and see where we are. But thank you very much, you guys, for being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.